Fluted columns and face frames dress up cabinets and bookcases. This jig makes fluting easier. It self-centers. Automatically clamps the workpiece. Perfectly spaces the flutes. And the end of all flutes are aligned. I use it to make tapered and stop flutes. And no measuring devices are needed. 3 tapered flutes that are perfectly centered, perfectly spaced, and with aligned endpoints. And here are the tools needed to make this fixture. Table saw, drill press, router, and none of these: rulers, combo squares, tape measures, and any other measuring devices are usually not needed in woodworking and shouldn't be used if they're not needed. Use the workpieces themselves is the quick and accurate way to go. Measure twice, cut once is a necessary saying because measuring is error prone. Stopped flutes run a consistent depth along a workpiece, and at the end of the run they just stop. Tapered flutes, like on this bookcase, ramp up at the end of the run. This fixture supports both stopped flutes and ramped or tapered flutes, as in this photo. There are some common ways that flutes are cut with parallel spacing. One is using a fence with a router. Measure each spacing and move the fence accordingly. Another method is using a router table with marks to show the start and the stop of the flutes. The workpiece is dropped down at the start, pushed through the router, and pulled up at the stop of the flutes. Then you move the fence over for the next flute. All measuring methods tend to introduce errors that are visible in the final product. This fixture precisely sets the center of the flute, and the spacing for all the flutes are consistent. On the outside are fences that can move in and out. In the middle is the workpiece into which the flutes will be cut, and between the fence and the workpiece are wedges. And the wedges can be slid in and out so as to increase or decrease the spacing between the workpiece and the fence. On each end are the stop blocks, which can be set up for either tapers via ramps or just a stop for stopped flutes. Here I am opening up the fixture. First I loosen the fences and slide them out. Then I loosen the end blocks and slide them off to the side, pull out the workpiece, and here's a set of wedges that I use to set the distance, and a second set of identical wedges. There's the base fixture. These are identical wedges, about as long as the fixture. As the hypotenuse mating sides slide against each other, the thickness of the wedge changes. The first step to use the fixture is to install the end blocks. The base of these end blocks should be the thickness of the workpiece. In my case, the base has 3 holes for 3 different endpoints for flutes. Here is a ramp for cutting tapered flutes. The end blocks can be adjusted in or out to accommodate different lengths of workpieces. Next, lay in the workpiece and bring the end blocks to the edge. It isn't important to align this left or right or up and down. Place the wedge pairs on either side of the workpiece. This is the key to alignment and spacing. I'm using a round over bit in my router to cut the flutes. The width of these boards sets the spacing between each flute. The space between the flutes is variable, as is the number of parallel flutes. Now comes the spacers for flute spacing. In this first example, two 3/4 inch boards are used to set up 3/4 on-center flute spacing. The router is centered between these two boards. I'm using a router with flat sides on the base, but routers with round bases would work fine too. There is play that has to be removed. First level adjustment is to reduce the play a bit. Slide wedges past each other to lessen the gap. The only important step is to make sure that the wedges are the same, that is, that the wedge pairs are identical to each other. Check play in Fixture again. Once it looks good, like it is adjusted, and each pair of wedges is identically aligned, then pull the fence together against the workpiece. Pulling each fence tight against the workpiece is what aligns the center perfectly. No measuring needed. Check the fit again. Nice fit. I'm going to cut flutes that are 5/8 inch apart. I'm using a 1/4 inch and a 3/8 inch board on each side to get that 5/8 spacing. For ease of handling, I'll put all 4 boards on one side as the fit is checked. Wedges need to slide in to adjust the gap. Rough fit is okay, so now pull fences into workpiece to center the board and lock it in place. Pull the end blocks in, tighten them down to lock in the workpiece. First, cut the center flute, spacer boards on either side. Next, both sets of spacers on the same side to cut one flute on the side of the center flute. Move the spacers to the other side and cut the last flute. After cutting all 3 flutes, this is the workpiece with tapered flutes. Perfectly centered, perfectly spaced, and perfectly lined up at the ends. I'll place a star block at the ends. That's why the tapers stop short of the board ends. If you don't need the adjustability of the wedges, you can make internal spacers like these. As long as they're ripped to the same width, they will self-center everything. The fixture supports variable numbers of flutes. Just choose the right number of spacer boards, and you can cut even numbers of flutes or odd numbers of flutes based on how many spacers that you use. 2 pieces of 1/2 inch plywood were glued together to make the 1 inch thickness needed for the T-rail screws. The dado grooves were cut using the width of the rails to set the dado width, and the depth of the dados was set by the T-rail depth plus a little bit more. Here is where I installed the T-rails. I don't think I'll flute any board too short, so I didn't extend the rail in the middle. Here, the side fences are installed. The end block base should be the same width as the workpiece. The stop block on top has a ramp feature to support tapered flutes. The end blocks are installed in the center rail The fences are left and right. The workpiece is laid in the center. Between the workpiece and the fence on either side are spacers, fixed ones in this example. The router fits between the left and right flute spacing board for center flute routing. For variable workpiece width and flute spacing, wedges are needed. Cut the wedges by stacking them and screwing them down at an angle on a straight board. The exact angle doesn't matter, as long as each wedge is exactly the same. Here's another view of the end block with the ramp on top for tapers. My flute endpoints are set back about 2 inches to accommodate the star detail. When I went to drill a hole for this, I used the star detail itself to set the distance. And here are a set of completed wedges. Here are some tips and tricks. Wax the mating faces of the wedges so that adjustments in the fixture are smoother, and mark which corner is the 90-degree corner, since it isn't visually obvious. Those pencil marks were my attempt at this. A pencil and the collet can help to see where the router will land. I used it to confirm that the distance from the end of the taper yielded enough room for the stars that I will add later. And remember 2 things. The pencil isn't necessarily centered, and don't run the router with the pencil installed. Routing stopped flutes can cause a burn mark at the end of the run. To minimize this, set router to the desired final depth, then raise it a little. I used a small piece of cardboard. Then route the flute, lower the router that last little bit, and run it again. The star detail was cut from this block. I'll use the block to set the rip fence. But first, I am going to cut the workpiece from this piece of wood. The edge of it has to be cut away because it's a little chopped up. I will first use the star detail block and get a rough centering here so that I can cut the workpiece. I then use the star detail to set the exact fence spacing so my workpiece will be the same width as the star block. Rip the workpiece. The star block detail on top of the workpiece shows that it's cut perfectly. Next, it's time to cut the workpiece length. The workpiece will be a face frame to this panel, so I'll use the panel to set the spacing from the teeth of the saw blade to the stop block that I'm adjusting. Before I can cut the workpiece to length, I need a fresh edge. You can't trust any edge if you haven't cut it. Now I rotate the piece over to make sure that my freshly cut edge is what sets against the stop block. Now I can cut and get exactly the right length for my workpiece. And here's a second workpiece that I'll use for the other side of the face frame. Let's check against the panel. That's a perfect fit for length. And that's a perfect fit for length. The less need to measure means more precision. This fixture is designed to minimize measuring, a source of error. What is the spacing between flutes? No need to measure. Fixture guarantees precise spacing. How wide is the router base? It doesn't matter. How wide are wedge spacers? I don't care. What are the dimensions of the end blocks? No need to know. Is the workpiece centered in the fixture lengthwise? Who cares? Is the workpiece centered between the fences? Yes, automatically. Top of the flutes to end of workpiece? Automatically aligned and correct. This fixture eliminates the need for measuring. The fences squeeze the wedges against the workpiece. This causes the workpiece to self-center, and it is then tightened in place. The end blocks slide in to meet the workpiece lengthwise wherever it sits. And the spacers are used to ensure that evenly spaced flutes are routed.